Somewhere in the vast bureaucratic nightmare that is the Galactic Military Consortium, a meeting was about to go spectacularly wrong. And when things go wrong in space, they don't just go wrong. They go wrong with the force of a collapsing star and twice the paperwork. General Claxon Bristlethorpe sat behind his crystalline desk, staring at a holographic display that showed Earth spinning lazily in the void. His three eyes blinked in sequence. A nervous tic that had developed after his last 17 military campaigns had ended in what the official reports diplomatically called suboptimal outcomes. What they really meant was that Claxon had the tactical brilliance of a particularly dense asteroid. "So," Claxon wheezed through his breathing apparatus, "this Earth requires conquest." His aide, a spindly creature named Flibbert Gooshington, nodded so vigorously that his antennae made a disturbing whistling sound. "Yes, sir. High Command has determined that this primitive planet poses a... Flibbert consulted his datapad, squinting at the text. "A strategic threat to our expansion into the outer spiral." Strategic threat? Claxon's middle eye twitched. From a planet that hasn't even figured out faster-than-light travel? That's what makes them so dangerous, sir," Flibbert exclaimed, clearly making this up as he went along. "They're unpredictable." Claxon pondered this with the intensity of someone trying to remember where they left their keys. The truth was, the Galactic Military Consortium had been having what you might call a bit of an image problem lately. Their last few conquests had been so embarrassingly easy that the Galactic News Network had started running comedy segments about them. Conquering a planet of sentient gas clouds? Boring. Subjugating a civilization of philosophical crystals? Yawn. They needed something with a bit more challenge. "Fine," Claxon declared, slapping his tentacle on the desk with all the authority of someone who had no idea what they were doing. "But I'm not sending our regular forces. They're too..." He paused, searching for the right word. "Competent." This was a lie. The consortium's regular forces had the combined military effectiveness of a particularly aggressive lunch menu, but Claxon had his reputation to think about. If he was going to fail again, he was going to fail with style. "Sir," Flibbert ventured, "we're outsourcing this one, Flibbert. Get me the best military contractors in the galaxy." And that, as they say in the better parts of the universe, was where things started to go really wrong. 3 parsecs away, in what could generously be described as the galaxy's most optimistic business district, CEO Quimbleton Fizzlebottom was having the kind of day that makes you question your life choices. His company, Planetary Acquisitions and Hostile Takeovers Incorporated, hadn't had a decent contract in months, and his creditors were beginning to make the sort of sounds that suggested they might start repossessing his vital organs. Quimbleton was a Vorthan, which meant he looked like someone had crossed a penguin with a very disappointed accountant and had the business acumen to match. His species was known throughout the galaxy for their ability to turn even the most promising venture into a spectacular failure through sheer determined incompetence. When Flibbert's call came through, Quimbleton nearly fell off his hoverchair with excitement. "A what kind of planet?" he squawked into the communicator. "Primitive, sir." "Very primitive, pre-FTL. They still use projectile weapons and combustion engines." Quimbleton's 3-chambered heart did a little dance. This was perfect. His company specialized in exactly this sort of backward world. Why, just last year they'd successfully conquered a planet of warrior poets who fought with sharpened metaphors. How hard could Earth be? "We'll take it," he announced, without even asking about the fee. "I'll send my best team immediately." His best team, it should be noted, consisted of whoever happened to be in the office at the time and wasn't currently hiding from the debt collectors. There was Griselda Snorkelwonk, a former accountant turned tactical specialist, whose idea of military strategy involved a lot of charts and an unhealthy obsession with pie graphs. Then there was Bixby Twiddlebonk, the weapons expert, who had once accidentally blown up his own training facility and somehow convinced everyone it was intentional. Finally, there was Norbert Fizzwidget, the intelligence analyst, whose intelligence gathering mostly consisted of reading outdated tourist brochures. "Right then, team," Quimbleton announced, gathering his crack squad in the company's only conference room, which doubled as a broom closet. "We're going to conquer Earth." "Where's Earth?" asked Bixby, who had the unfortunate habit of asking exactly the wrong question at exactly the wrong time. Norbert consulted his datapad, which was displaying information that was approximately 47 years out of date. According to this, it's a peaceful agricultural world populated by simple farmers who worship primitive sky gods and have no military capability whatsoever. "Perfect!" Quimbleton rubbed his flippers together gleefully. "We'll be in and out in no time. Griselda, what's our tactical assessment?" Griselda pulled out an enormous chart that somehow managed to make the conquest of an entire planet look like a quarterly sales projection. "Well, according to my calculations, if we land during their harvest season, we can probably negotiate a surrender in exchange for helping with the crops." This plan had exactly one problem with it. It was based on information from Earth's Bronze Age. The universe, as Douglas Adams once observed, has a peculiar sense of humor. It delights in placing the most absurdly overconfident beings in direct collision with the most dangerously underestimated forces, then sitting back to watch the cosmic fireworks. Barnaby Crustworth, former United States Marine, current owner of 47 acres of stubbornly uncooperative farmland in rural Montana, was having what he liked to call a typical Tuesday. This meant that his tractor had broken down again. His prize bull was having an existential crisis about the meaning of grass, and his nearest neighbor was 12 miles away and tended to communicate exclusively through gunshots and meaningful glances. Barney was 63 years old, had served 3 tours in places that officially didn't exist, and had the kind of weathered face that suggested he'd seen things that would make a lesser man take up interpretive dance as a coping mechanism. He'd retired to Montana for the peace and quiet, and had spent the last 8 years discovering that peace and quiet were significantly more work than anyone had bothered to mention. He was currently lying under his tractor, swearing at a particularly stubborn bolt with the creative profanity that only comes from 25 years of military service, when the sky lit up like the 4th of July having an argument with New Year's Eve. "Well, hell," Barney muttered, rolling out from under the tractor and squinting up at what appeared to be a spacecraft roughly the size of a city bus, hovering about 50 feet above his cabbage patch. "That's new." The ship was making a sound like a very large bee having a nervous breakdown, and was decorated with what appeared to be the galactic equivalent of racing stripes, except they were lime green and seemed to be applied with all the artistic sensibility of a drunk toddler with a crayon. A hatch opened in the bottom of the craft, and a ramp extended downward with a mechanical whirring that suggested it probably needed oiling badly. Barney watched with the sort of calm interest that comes from having seen Stranger Things on a Thursday afternoon in Kandahar as 4 figures descended the ramp. They were walking in what was clearly meant to be an intimidating formation, except that one of them kept tripping over his own feet, another was consulting what appeared to be a manual, and the third was taking pictures with what was obviously a tourist camera. The 4th figure, who was clearly the leader, approached Barney with the sort of swagger that suggested he'd practiced this moment in front of a mirror many times. "Greetings, primitive Earth being," Quimbleton announced in what he believed was a commanding voice, but which actually sounded like a dolphin trying to order coffee. "I am Quimbleton Fizzlebottom, CEO of Planetary Acquisitions and Hostile Takeovers Incorporated. You will surrender your world to our superior technology and wisdom." Barney looked at the creature, which resembled a penguin that had gotten into a fight with a business suit and lost, then looked at the other 3 aliens, who were now arguing about which way was north, while standing directly under their own spacecraft. Barney said, which was his standard response to most things that didn't immediately require shooting. Did Did he understand me? Quimbleton whispered to Griselda, who was busy taking soil samples for reasons that weren't entirely clear to anyone, including herself. Perhaps he's in shock at our magnificent presence, suggested Bixby, who had somehow managed to get his weapon tangled in what appeared to be a butterfly net. Barney watched this display with growing fascination. In his military career, he'd faced down insurgents, warlords, and at least one very angry yak, but he'd never encountered anything quite like this particular brand of weaponized incompetence. "You boys lost?" he asked finally, in the sort of tone he'd used to address tourists who'd wandered too far from the main road. "Lost?" Quimbleton sputtered. "We are not lost. We are conquerors. We have come to claim this world in the name of the Galactic Military Consortium." "Uh-huh," Barney nodded slowly. "And you picked my farm because—" There was a moment of silence while the four aliens looked at each other with the dawning realization that this was an excellent question and none of them had a good answer. "Strategic importance?" Norbert ventured, consulting his datapad again. "It says here this is the, Center of Agricultural Excellence for your entire civilization." Barney looked around at his 47 acres of stubborn dirt, broken machinery, and one philosophically troubled bull. Agricultural excellence. Right. He paused. "You boys want some coffee? You look like you could use some coffee." This was not going according to the plan. Quimbleton had envisioned dramatic speeches, perhaps some ceremonial surrender of primitive weapons, maybe even a parade in his honor. He had not envisioned being offered refreshments by what was supposed to be a terrified farmer. "We do not require your primitive stimulants," he declared, though privately he thought coffee sounded rather nice. It had been a long flight, and the ship's food synthesizer had been producing nothing but something that tasted like liquidized disappointment. "Suit yourself," Barney shrugged, "but I'm going to get some. This tractor isn't going to fix itself, and you fellas don't look like you know much about internal combustion engines." He walked toward his house, leaving the four aliens standing in his driveway, looking like they'd just been politely dismissed by their own conquest. Should we follow him?" asked Bixby. "No," Quimbleton snapped. "We maintain our position. He's probably gone to gather the local military forces." Inside his kitchen, Barney poured himself a cup of coffee and looked out the window at the four figures who were now having what appeared to be a heated argument about proper invasion protocols. He'd seen enough amateur operations in his time to recognize one when he saw it. And this had all the hallmarks of a plan that had been conceived by committee and implemented by people who'd never actually seen combat. The coffee was good, the aliens were still arguing, and somewhere in the back of his mind, the part of Barney that had kept him alive through 3 wars was starting to pay attention. After 20 minutes of increasingly frantic debate, Quimbleton decided to take decisive action. He would demonstrate the superiority of their technology by disintegrating something impressive. He activated his plasma rifle, aimed at what he believed was a primitive food storage facility, and pulled the trigger. The barn, which had been holding up reasonably well for something built in 1987, promptly exploded in a shower of splinters and very surprised chickens. Barney, who'd been enjoying the peace and quiet, suddenly found his kitchen window decorated with what appeared to be the remains of his chicken coop and several extremely indignant fowl. "God damn it!" he roared, charging out of his house with the sort of righteous fury that only comes from having your morning interrupted by incompetent extraterrestrials. "Ah!" Quimbleton exclaimed triumphantly. "Now you see the power of our advanced weaponry. Surrender now, and we will show mercy." Barney stopped about 10 feet away from the 4 aliens and fixed them with the sort of look that had once made a Taliban commander reconsider his life choices. "You," he said quietly, "just killed my chickens." "Yes, and we will kill more chickens unless you—" Barney moved. 40 years of military training, combined with 8 years of frustration at everything from broken tractors to philosophical bulls, erupted in a display of violence that was both precise and utterly devastating. In the space of approximately 4 seconds, he had disarmed Bixby, tied Griselda's tentacles in a knot that would have impressed a Boy Scout, used Norbert as an impromptu club to knock Quimbleton unconscious, and somehow managed to do it all without spilling his coffee. When the dust settled, 4 of the galaxy's most feared conquest specialists were lying in a heap next to their spacecraft, and Barney was standing over them, still holding his coffee mug, looking mildly irritated. "What the hell just happened?" Bixby wailed from somewhere underneath Griselda. "I think," Norbert said weakly, "our intelligence was slightly inaccurate." Quimbleton, who was seeing several more stars than were usually visible during Earth's daytime, struggled to his feet and stared at Barney with something approaching religious awe. You're not a primitive farmer," he whispered. "Nope," Barney confirmed, taking a sip of his coffee. "I'm a retired Marine. There's a difference." And that difference, as the 4 aliens were about to discover, was approximately equivalent to the gap between a firecracker and a hydrogen bomb. 30 minutes later, the aliens found themselves sitting around Barney's kitchen table, each nursing various injuries and what appeared to be severe damage to their collective ego. Barney had made them coffee anyway, because he was raised to be polite to guests, even if those guests had recently destroyed his chicken coop and interrupted his morning routine. "So, let me get this straight," Barney said, leaning back in his chair and regarding his involuntary visitors with the sort of patient expression usually reserved for explaining complex concepts to small children. "You're professional planet conquerors. The best professional planet conquerors," Quimbleton corrected, though his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "We have an impeccable track record of successful acquisitions." "Uh-huh. And you came here because someone told you Earth was full of primitive farmers with no military capabilities?" "Well, yes. And your plan was to land in the middle of Montana, blow up random buildings, and expect the entire planet to surrender." Aye, the 4 aliens exchanged glances that suggested they were beginning to see some flaws in their strategy. "It's worked before," Griselda protested weakly. "On what kind of planets?" Barney asked with genuine curiosity. "Well, there was Flibdonia Prime, where the inhabitants communicate entirely through interpretive dance, and Quargblatt 7, where the dominant species are sentient flowers who consider loud noises to be acts of violence. Oh, and Boing Boing, where everyone is basically a large, friendly marshmallow." Barney stared at them. "Marshmallows. Very large marshmallows," Bixby clarified hopefully. "I see." Barney took another sip of his coffee and considered this information. In his experience, there were 2 types of dangerous people in the universe: those who were competent and malicious, and those who were incompetent and well-meaning. The first type tried to kill you quickly. The second type could destroy entire civilizations by accident. "So," he continued, "what exactly happens when you report back to your bosses that your conquest of Earth didn't go according to plan?" The question caused an immediate outbreak of panic among the 4 aliens. Quimbleton began making the sort of distressed noises that suggested his species had evolved from creatures that spent a lot of time being chased by predators. Griselda started rapidly calculating something on her datapad that appeared to involve a lot of very large negative numbers. Bixby was hyperventilating into what looked like a paper bag, except it was made of some sort of metallic fabric and kept making crinkling sounds. Norbert was simply staring into the middle distance with the expression of someone contemplating the heat death of the universe. "We're ruined," Quimbleton wailed. "Our reputation, our business, our vital organs, which will probably be repossessed by our creditors." "Vital organs can be repossessed?" Barney asked, because that seemed like the sort of thing a person should know. "Oh, yes," Griselda nodded miserably. "Standard business practice in the Outer Rim. Default on your loans, lose your liver. It's very efficient. Barney digested this information along with his coffee. He'd thought military bureaucracy was bad, but apparently civilian bureaucracy in space had reached levels of dysfunction that bordered on the artistic. "Well," he said finally, "I guess you boys have got yourselves a problem." "We have a problem?" Quimbleton shrieked. "You're the one who just assaulted 4 representatives of a major galactic corporation. Do you have any idea what kind of legal trouble you're in?" Barney gave him a look that could have frozen lava. "Son, I've been in legal trouble with entities you can't even pronounce. The United States Marine Corps has lawyers that could make your entire species file for bankruptcy just by looking at your tax returns. You want to play the legal game? I'll introduce you to some people who turn litigation into an art form." This was, of course, complete nonsense, but Barney had learned long ago that confidence could carry you through almost any situation, especially when dealing with people who didn't know enough to call your bluff. The 4 aliens huddled together and began whispering in what was probably their native language, but sounded like someone trying to tune a radio made of angry cats. "What are they doing?" Barney asked himself, then decided he didn't really want to know. After several minutes of frantic consultation, Quimbleton turned back to Barney with the expression of someone who had just made a decision that was going to haunt him for the rest of his natural life. We would like to make you an offer," he said carefully. "I'm listening. What would you say to a position as our consultant?" Barney raised an eyebrow. "Consultant for what?" "Military strategy, tactical planning, hostile environment assessment." Quimbleton was clearly making this up as he went along, but with the sort of desperate creativity that comes from facing imminent organ repossession. "You obviously know more about actual combat than our entire company combined." "That," Barney observed, "is not saying much." "Exactly, which is why we need you. Think about it. You could help us become competent. We could learn from your expertise. Everyone wins." Barney considered this. On one hand, he'd come to Montana specifically to avoid getting involved in other people's problems. On the other hand, these 4 were so spectacularly inept that they represented a clear and present danger to themselves and anyone unfortunate enough to be in their general vicinity. Leaving them to their own devices was probably a crime against the universe. Plus, his chickens were dead, his barn was gone, and his tractor was still broken. A little excitement might be exactly what he needed. "What kind of consultant fee are we talking about?" he asked. The relief on the aliens' faces was so profound that Barney briefly wondered if their species was capable of crying tears of joy. "Whatever you want," Quimbleton exclaimed. "Money! Technology! A nice house on a pleasant planet with good weather and no predators! How about you start by helping me fix my tractor?" And so it was that 4 of the galaxy's most incompetent military contractors found themselves spending the afternoon learning about internal combustion engines from a retired Marine who was beginning to suspect that his quiet retirement had just come to an abrupt end. The tractor, it turned out, was not significantly more complex than the alien spacecraft, but it was considerably more reliable. Bixby, despite his tendency to accidentally destroy things, actually had a knack for mechanical work once someone explained to him which end of a wrench to hold. Griselda's obsession with charts and calculations proved surprisingly useful when applied to engine timing. Norbert's habit of reading instruction manuals compulsively meant he could actually follow the maintenance procedures correctly. Quimbleton mostly supervised and made increasingly nervous phone calls to his creditors. "This is fascinating," Bixby exclaimed, his head buried deep in the engine compartment. "Your primitive technology is so elegantly simple. No quantum flux capacitors, no dimensional phase inverters, no probability dampeners. It just works." "That's the idea," Barney agreed, watching with some amusement as Griselda created what appeared to be a complete schematic diagram of a carburetor. "Most of our stuff is designed to be fixed by people who don't have engineering degrees." "Remarkable." Norbert was reading the tractor's manual with the sort of intense fascination usually reserved for religious texts. According to this, routine maintenance requires only basic tools and elementary knowledge of mechanical principles. No specialized training, no certification in hyperdimensional mechanics. Amazing! Barney was beginning to understand why these four had found it so easy to conquer planets populated by sentient marshmallows. They were so accustomed to technology that required advanced degrees just to operate that they'd never encountered anything designed for actual practical use. "So," he said as they worked, "how exactly does the planet conquest business work? You just show up, wave some fancy weapons around and hope everyone surrenders?" "Well," Quimbleton said defensively, "it's more sophisticated than that. There's market research, preliminary assessments, risk analysis. All done by Norbert's tourist brochures? They're very comprehensive tourist brochures." Barney nodded thoughtfully. "And nobody's ever fought back before. Why would they?" Griselda looked up from her carburetor diagram with genuine confusion. "We have superior technology, advanced weapons, faster-than-light travel. Who would be stupid enough to fight against such overwhelming advantages? People who don't want to be conquered, maybe." This concept appeared to be entirely novel to all four aliens. They stared at Barney as if he'd just suggested that gravity might not be voluntary. But that's irrational," Bixby protested. "Resistance is illogical when the outcome is predetermined." "Son," Barney said patiently, "you just learned something important about humans. We specialize in being irrational when someone tells us we don't have a choice." Before anyone could respond to this philosophical observation, Quimbleton's communicator started making the sort of urgent beeping sounds that suggested someone very important wanted to have a very unpleasant conversation. "Oh shit," Quimbleton muttered, which was apparently a universal expression of dismay. "It's General Claxon." "Your boss?" Barney asked. "My boss's boss, and he wants a status report." The communicator continued its increasingly frantic beeping, and Quimbleton stared at it with the expression of someone watching their own funeral arrangements being made. "Answer it," Barney suggested. "But we haven't conquered anything yet. We haven't even figured out how to get off this farm without getting lost. So tell him the truth." "The truth?" Quimbleton looked horrified. "I can't tell him the truth. He'll have my business license revoked, my organs repossessed. My mother will disown me." "Your mother?" She co-signed the startup loan. Barney was beginning to appreciate the full scope of the situation. These weren't just incompetent invaders. They were incompetent invaders with family financial obligations and performance anxiety. The communicator's beeping reached a crescendo that suggested someone's patience was wearing thin, and Quimbleton finally answered with the enthusiasm of someone reporting their own death. "Fizzle bottom here," he said weakly. The holographic image that appeared above the communicator made Barney think of an octopus that had gotten into a fight with a military uniform and somehow lost. General Claxon's 3 eyes were flashing different colors, which probably wasn't a good sign. "Fizzle bottom," the general bellowed in a voice that sounded like gravel being processed through a meat grinder. "Where is my conquest report? Where are my subjugated primitives? Where is my complete and total domination of Earth?" "Well, sir," Quimbleton began, and then stopped, apparently unable to figure out how to explain that they'd been defeated by one human armed with nothing but military training and righteous indignation. "We've encountered some unexpected complications," he said finally. "Complications?" General Claxon's middle eye began rotating in a way that suggested either intense concentration or an impending stroke. What kind of complications could possibly arise from conquering a planet of primitive farmers? Barney, who had been listening to this exchange with growing amusement, decided it was time to introduce himself. "The kind of complications that arise when your intelligence is about 40 years out of date," he said, stepping into view of the communicator. General Claxon stared at him with all 3 eyes. Who is this primitive?" "Retired Gunnery Sergeant Barnaby Crustworth, United States Marine Corps." Barney replied with the sort of crisp professionalism that suggested this wasn't his first time dealing with confused superior officers. "And you are? I am General Claxon Bristlethorpe of the Galactic Military Consortium. You will show proper respect for your betters, primitive." Barney gave him the sort of look that had once convinced a Taliban commander to reconsider his career choices. "General, with all due respect, your boys here couldn't conquer a lemonade stand if it was staffed by sleeping children. Maybe you want to reconsider your approach." The silence that followed this observation was the sort of profound quiet that usually precedes either enlightenment or violence. General Claxon's eyes stopped flashing and fixed on Barney with the intensity of someone seeing their entire worldview collapse in real time. "Excuse me?" he said very quietly. "Your invasion plan, sir. It's got some holes in it." "And holes? My invasion plan is flawless. It was designed by the finest military minds in the consortium." "Then you might want to ask for your money back, because these four just got their asses handed to them by one retired Marine with a cup of coffee." The aliens around the table began making the sort of nervous sounds that suggested they were witnessing something that was either historic or catastrophic, and possibly both. General Claxon was silent for several long moments, his three eyes moving independently as he apparently processed this information. When he finally spoke, his voice had the sort of controlled calm that meant someone was about to make a very bad decision. "Fizzlebottom," he said slowly. "You will maintain your position. I am sending Admiral Gorthak with the 73rd Conquest Fleet to resolve this situation." "Sir?" Quimbleton's voice cracked like a teenager asking for his first date. "Admiral Gorthak has never failed to subdue a primitive world. He will show these humans the true power of the Galactic Military Consortium." The hologram flickered and died, leaving 5 beings sitting around a kitchen table in Montana, contemplating what was probably going to be a very interesting next few days. "So," Barney said after a moment, "Admiral Gorthak, should I be worried?" The expression on the 4 aliens' faces suggested that yes, he probably should be. "Admiral Gorthak," Quimbleton whispered, "is what you might call efficient." "Efficient how?" "He once sterilized an entire star system because he got a parking ticket there." "For a parking ticket?" "He doesn't like to be inconvenienced," Griselda explained helpfully. "His methods are thorough." Barney considered this information while finishing his coffee. In his experience, there were 2 kinds of military leaders: those who were competent and reasonable, and those who compensated for incompetence with excessive violence. If Admiral Gorthak was being sent to deal with a situation that 4 bumbling contractors couldn't handle, he was probably the second type. "How long until he gets here?" Barney asked. "Standard transit time from the nearest consortium base would be approximately 18 hours, Norbert calculated, consulting his datapad. 18 hours. Barney nodded slowly. "Well, boys, I guess we'd better get ready for company." "Get ready?" Bixby looked confused. "Get ready how?" "Admiral Gorthak commands a fleet of 1,200 warships. Each one is capable of reducing a continent to vapor. What could we possibly do to get ready for that?" Barney stood up, walked to a cabinet, and pulled out what appeared to be a very old, very well-maintained rifle. The aliens stared at it with the sort of fascination usually reserved for museum pieces. "Is that a projectile weapon?" Griselda asked in wonder. "M1 Garand," Barney confirmed, checking the action with practiced efficiency. "World War II vintage. Still works like the day it was made. But what can one primitive projectile weapon do against advanced spacecraft?" Barney looked at the 4 aliens with something that might have been sympathy. "Boys, you're about to learn something very important about humans. We don't win fights because we have the best weapons. We win fights because we're too stupid to know when we're beaten." Over the next several hours, Barney provided his new alien friends with what he called a crash course in human military philosophy. This mostly consisted of explaining why most military plans didn't survive contact with the enemy, why adaptation was more important than technology, and why Marines were trained to improvise solutions that would make engineers cry. Quimbleton took notes with the sort of frantic dedication usually seen in graduate students facing their final exams. Griselda created charts that attempted to quantify concepts like stubbornness and righteous fury. Bixby asked approximately 400 questions about why humans would choose to fight battles they couldn't win. Norbert read every military manual in Barney's small collection and became increasingly concerned about the psychological profile of the species he was supposed to be conquering. "This makes no logical sense," he protested after reading about the Battle of Thermopylae. 300 Spartans against hundreds of thousands of Persians. The mathematics alone should have prevented them from even trying. "That's the point," Barney explained patiently. "Sometimes the math doesn't matter. Sometimes you fight because it's the right thing to do, not because you can win. But they lost. Did they? Ask the Persians how that worked out for them in the long run." This led to a lengthy discussion about the difference between tactical defeats and strategic victories, which in turn led to Barney explaining why the Alamo was considered a triumph, despite being a complete military disaster, which then somehow evolved into a conversation about why Americans would rather die than pay taxes without representation. The aliens found this utterly baffling. In their experience, superior technology and overwhelming force were supposed to automatically result in victory. The idea that an opponent might choose to fight anyway, might actually become more dangerous when cornered, was completely alien to their military thinking. "So you're saying," Quimbleton said slowly, "that humans become more dangerous when they're losing?" "Some do. The smart ones figure out how to stop losing. The crazy ones figure out how to make the other guy lose worse." "And which type are you?" Barney grinned, and for the first time since landing on Earth, the four aliens began to understand why their simple conquest mission had gone so spectacularly wrong. "I'm a Marine, son. We specialize in being both." As the sun set over Montana, Admiral Gorthak's fleet was approaching Earth's solar system with all the subtlety of a cosmic hurricane. The Admiral himself sat in his command throne, reviewing intelligence reports and working himself into the sort of controlled fury that had made him legendary throughout the galaxy. Admiral Gorthak belonged to a species called the Vorthani, who looked like someone had crossed a rhinoceros with a very angry accountant and given the result delusions of grandeur. He had spent 40 years turning rebellious planets into cautionary tales and had never encountered a problem that couldn't be solved with sufficient application of overwhelming firepower. "Status report!" he barked at his aide, a nervous creature named Flibbert, who bore an unfortunate resemblance to a praying mantis having an anxiety attack. "We are approaching the target system, Admiral. All ships report ready for immediate planetary bombardment." "Excellent. I want this primitive backwater reduced to molten slag within the hour. These humans need to learn what happens when they interfere with consortium operations." "Sir?" Flibbert ventured nervously. "Shouldn't we attempt to establish communication first? Perhaps negotiate a surrender?" Admiral Gorthak turned to stare at his aide with the sort of look that suggested Flibbert's life expectancy had just decreased significantly. "Negotiate?" the Admiral said very quietly. "With primitives who have somehow managed to defeat a professional conquest team, who have the audacity to resist the rightful authority of the consortium, who probably don't even have proper filing systems for surrender documents." "But, sir, General Claxon specifically mentioned that they seemed unusually capable." "Capable?" Admiral Gorthak's voice rose to a pitch that made nearby equipment rattle in sympathy. "They're primitives, Flibbert. Pre-FTL barbarians who probably still think faster than light travel violates the laws of physics. How capable could they possibly be?" This was, as it turned out, exactly the wrong question to ask about a species that had invented nuclear weapons before they figured out how to leave their own planet. Back on Earth, Barney was making final preparations for what he suspected was going to be either a very short fight or a very interesting day. He'd spent the evening teaching his alien companions the finer points of guerrilla warfare, improvised explosives, and why it was never a good idea to underestimate an opponent who had nothing left to lose. "So let me get this straight," Bixby said, studying a diagram that Barney had sketched on the back of a feed sack. "You want us to disable our own ship?" "Not disable," Barney corrected. "Modify. Big difference." The plan, such as it was, relied heavily on the principle that sometimes the best defense was a good offense, and sometimes the best offense was making your enemy think you were completely insane. Barney had learned this technique from a Pashtun warlord who had successfully held off 3 different armies by convincing them that fighting him would be more trouble than it was worth. "This is never going to work," Quimbleton protested, though he was helping anyway because the alternative seemed significantly worse. "It doesn't have to work," Barney replied, making adjustments to what had once been the ship's navigation system and was now something that would probably give safety inspectors nightmares. "It just has to be unexpected. But Admiral Gorthak has 1,200 ships. We have 1 barely functional spacecraft and 4 beings who couldn't successfully conquer a planet of pacifist marshmallows." 5 beings, Barney corrected. "And I've seen what happens when people underestimate pacifist marshmallows. Sometimes they turn out to be more dangerous than anyone expected." He was, of course, making this up, but confidence was half the battle, and the other half was making sure your enemy didn't know what the hell you were doing until it was too late to stop you. At precisely 0347 local time, Admiral Gorthak's fleet dropped out of hyperspace with all the subtlety of a cosmic sledgehammer. 1,200 warships, each one capable of sterilizing a continent, arranged themselves in a perfect formation around Earth, like the galaxy's most destructive Christmas ornament. Admiral Gorthak stood on his command bridge, surveying the primitive blue-green world that hung before him, like a particularly annoying problem waiting to be solved. "Scan the planet," he ordered. "I want to know exactly where these upstart primitives are hiding, so I can make their destruction appropriately theatrical." "Sir," his sensor operator reported, "we're detecting unusual energy readings from the planet's surface, specifically from the coordinates where Fizzlebottom's team was supposed to be conducting the conquest." "Unusual how?" "The readings suggest, well, sir, it appears they've jury-rigged some sort of broadcasting system using parts from their own spacecraft." Admiral Gorthak's 3 eyes blinked in sequence, which was his species equivalent of a double take. "They've done what?" "They appear to be attempting to communicate with us, sir." This was so far outside Admiral Gorthak's experience that for a moment he simply stood there, his mouth opening and closing like a fish trying to remember how to breathe. In 40 years of military service, he had never encountered an enemy who wanted to talk to him while he was in the process of destroying their world. "Put them through," he said finally, because his curiosity had gotten the better of his professional outrage. The view screen flickered to life, revealing what appeared to be the interior of a primitive dwelling. 5 figures sat around what looked like a crude wooden table, and one of them was clearly not like the others. "Good morning, Admiral," Barney said pleasantly, as if he was greeting a neighbor who'd stopped by for coffee. "I'm Gunnery Sergeant Barnaby Crustworth, and I believe you're here about my new employees." Admiral Gorthak stared at the screen with all 3 eyes. The human looked completely calm, which was wrong. He should be cowering in terror, or at least showing some sign of appropriate respect for the overwhelming military force currently surrounding his planet. "You," the Admiral began, then stopped, because he suddenly realized he had no idea what to say to someone who was treating the imminent destruction of their world like a minor scheduling inconvenience. "Cat got your tongue, Admiral?" Barney asked helpfully. "That's an Earth expression. Means you seem to be having trouble speaking." This is Admiral Gorthak of the 73rd Conquest Fleet," the Admiral finally managed to bellow. "You will surrender immediately or face complete annihilation." "Well," Barney said thoughtfully, "that's certainly an option, But before you start blowing things up, I thought you might want to hear about the new business proposal your boys here have been working on." "Business proposal?" Quimbleton cleared his throat nervously. "Admiral, sir, we've been conducting what you might call market research, and we've discovered some significant inefficiencies in our current conquest methodology." "Inefficiencies?" Admiral Gorthak's voice reached a pitch that probably violated several laws of physics. "There are no inefficiencies. We arrive, we conquer, we move on. It's worked for 40 years. On planets populated by sentient flowers and marshmallows," Barney pointed out. "When was the last time you tried to conquer a planet where the inhabitants actually fought back?" This question hit Admiral Gorthak like a physical blow, because the honest answer was never. The consortium had been so successful at picking easy targets that they'd never actually developed tactics for dealing with serious resistance. "We have never needed to deal with serious resistance," the Admiral sputtered. "Our technology is supreme, our firepower is overwhelming, our tactics are flawless." "Your tactics," Barney said gently, "are about to get 1,200 ships and their crews killed by one retired Marine with a sense of humor." The bridge of Admiral Gorthak's flagship fell silent, except for the hum of life support systems and the distant sound of someone's career ending in real time. "Explain," the Admiral said very quietly. Barney leaned back in his chair and smiled the sort of smile that had once convinced a room full of Taliban commanders that surrendering was their best option. "Well, Admiral, it's like this. You've got 1,200 ships up there, all clustered nice and tight in a textbook formation, probably running standard patrol patterns, maintaining proper communication protocols, following all the rules in the book." "Of course we are. We are a professional military force." "Right. And about 10 minutes ago, my friends here finished modifying their little ship to broadcast a very special signal on a very specific frequency." Admiral Gorthak felt something cold forming in the pit of his stomach. "What kind of signal?" "The kind that makes your ship's computer systems think they're receiving legitimate command codes from fleet headquarters." The cold feeling in Admiral Gorthak's stomach rapidly expanded to encompass his entire digestive system. That's impossible. "Our communications are encrypted with quantum-level security protocols." "Your communications," Barney agreed, "are very secure. But your friends here had all the proper authorization codes, didn't they? They were legitimate contractors, working for the consortium, with full access to your command frequencies." The silence on the bridge stretched out like a rubber band approaching its breaking point. "Flibbert," Admiral Gorthak said very slowly, "please tell me our ships are not actually responding to whatever signal these primitives are broadcasting." Flibbert consulted his instruments with the sort of desperate hope usually reserved for lottery tickets and prayer. His antennae drooped as he read the displays. "Sir," he said weakly, "I'm showing anomalous readings from approximately 60% of the fleet." "What kind of anomalous readings?" "Well, sir, it appears that ships 94 through 312 believe they've received orders to begin a coordinated attack pattern on ships 1 through 93. "What?" "And ships 500 through 800 appear to think they're supposed to be defending ships 1 through 93 from the attack by ships 94 through 312. "That's impossible!" "And, sir," Flibbert's voice had reached the sort of pitch usually associated with helium inhalation, "ships 801 through 1200 seem to believe they're supposed to be attacking everyone else because someone has accused the fleet of mutiny." Admiral Gorthak stared at his displays as 1,200 of the galaxy's most advanced warships began shooting at each other with the sort of enthusiasm usually reserved for religious festivals. "How?" he screamed. "How is this possible?" "Well," Barney said helpfully from the view screen, "your boys here turned out to be real quick learners. Seems your command protocols were designed by the same people who thought conquering Earth would be easy. Lots of assumptions, not much real-world testing." On the screen behind Barney, Bixby waved cheerfully. It was actually quite simple once we understood the underlying logic. Your systems are designed to prevent external interference, but they assume that anyone with legitimate access codes must be trustworthy. Which, Griselda added, consulting one of her inevitable charts, represents a fundamental flaw in your security architecture. The statistical probability of this particular exploit being discovered and utilized, Norbert said, reading from his datapad, was apparently calculated at approximately 1 in 14 billion. Unfortunately, that calculation appears to have been wrong. Admiral Gorthak watched in horror as his fleet continued its enthusiastic self-destruction. Explosions bloomed across his view screen like deadly flowers, and the careful formation that had taken 40 years to perfect dissolved into complete chaos. "This is madness," he roared. "No," Barney corrected. "This is Marines. We specialize in making the impossible look easy and the easy look impossible." But you're just one human. One human with 4 friends who turned out to be smarter than your entire military intelligence division," Barney agreed. "Sometimes that's all it takes." Admiral Gorthak collapsed into his command chair with the expression of someone watching their entire worldview crumble in real time. 40 years of military doctrine, 40 years of successful conquests, 40 years of unquestioned superiority, all undone by one human and 4 corporate consultants with access to the wrong instruction manual. "Sir," Flibbert reported quietly, "we're down to approximately 400 functional ships, and they're all requesting new orders because their current orders are apparently contradictory and possibly treasonous." "What?" Admiral Gorthak's voice had the hollow quality of someone speaking from the bottom of a very deep hole. "What do you want?" "Well," Barney said, leaning forward slightly, "that depends on what you're offering." "Offering? I'm offering to not reduce your planet to cosmic dust." "With what? You've got 400 ships left. They're all confused. And my friends here have already demonstrated that your command systems are about as secure as a screen door in a hurricane." This was, Admiral Gorthak realized, an excellent point. "Besides," Barney continued, "I'm not really interested in fighting. I just wanted to make sure you understood the situation before we started negotiations." "Negotiations? Sure. See, these 4 here have got themselves a business problem. They promised their creditors they'd deliver a successful conquest, but they can't exactly do that if you blow up their target before they finish the paperwork." Admiral Gorthak looked at the screen with the expression of someone trying to solve a mathematical equation using only interpretive dance. Are you saying you want us to let them conquer your planet?" "I'm saying maybe we can work out a deal that makes everyone happy." "What kind of deal?" Barney smiled. "The kind where nobody has to explain to their bosses why 1,200 ships couldn't handle one retired Marine." 2 hours later, Admiral Gorthak found himself in the most surreal situation of his 40-year military career, conducting formal surrender negotiations with a human who kept offering him coffee and seemed genuinely concerned about his professional reputation. "So let me understand this," the Admiral said, rubbing his temples with 2 of his 4 hands. "You want us to stage a fake conquest." "Not fake," Barney corrected. "Mutually beneficial. Your boys get to report a successful mission, you get to save face with your superiors, and I get my barn rebuilt." "Your barn?" "They blew up my chickens. I'm still upset about that." Admiral Gorthak stared at the human who had just humiliated the finest fleet in the galaxy and was now negotiating compensation for poultry. The universe, he decided, had a very twisted sense of humor. "And in exchange for this arrangement, you'll help us fix our command systems?" "Better than that. I'll help you design new command systems, ones that might actually work against opponents who fight back." "You would do that? Why?" Barney shrugged. "Because if you don't learn how to handle real resistance, you're going to keep picking fights with people who are going to hand you your ass. And some of those people might not be as reasonable as I am." This was a terrifying thought. If there were other humans like this one, the entire consortium military doctrine would need to be completely rebuilt from the ground up. There is one small problem, Admiral Gorthak said carefully. What's that? While we were having this conversation, my superiors appear to have detected our difficulties and are sending the Grand Admiral with the First Imperial Fleet to investigate. The smile faded from Barney's face. How big is the First Imperial Fleet? 5,000 ships. Led by Grand Admiral Vorthak the Terrible, whose idea of negotiation is to destroy solar systems and ask questions later. Barney was quiet for a long moment, and the four aliens around his table began making the sort of nervous sounds that suggested they were contemplating their own mortality. "Well," Barney said finally, "I guess we'd better get to work then." "Work? On what?" "Teaching you boys how to fight a real war." Over the next 6 hours, the most bizarre military training operation in galactic history took place in Earth's orbit. Admiral Gorthak's remaining 400 ships were reorganized according to principles that would have made traditional military strategists weep: unpredictable movement patterns, redundant command structures, tactical flexibility over rigid doctrine, and a healthy respect for the possibility that the enemy might not read the same tactical manuals you did. Barney conducted the training via view screen from his kitchen table, occasionally pausing to make more coffee or explain why certain time-honored military traditions were actually terrible ideas when facing a competent opponent. "The problem with your standard fleet formations," he explained while Griselda took notes and Admiral Gorthak had what appeared to be a nervous breakdown, "is that they assume your enemy is going to be polite about following conventional tactics. But military doctrine exists for a reason," Admiral Gorthak protested. "Without proper formations, without standard procedures, we'll have chaos." "Son, chaos is just another word for the enemy can't predict what you're going to do next. Sometimes that's exactly what you want. This goes against everything I've learned in 40 years of military service." "And how's that been working out for you lately?" It was, Admiral Gorthak had to admit, an excellent question. As the training continued, something remarkable began to happen. The crews of the remaining ships, freed from the rigid constraints of traditional doctrine, began to display a creativity and initiative that had been systematically trained out of them by decades of following proper procedures. Ship commanders started developing their own tactical innovations. Engineering crews found ways to modify their systems for maximum unpredictability. Even the administrative staff began thinking of ways to make their logistics more flexible and responsive. "This is fascinating," Quimbleton exclaimed, watching the tactical displays with the sort of excitement usually reserved for major sporting events. "They're actually enjoying themselves." "People like solving problems," Barney observed. "Most military organizations just never give them permission to try." But even as Admiral Gorthak's fleet was being transformed from a rigid formation into something resembling an actual fighting force, long-range sensors were detecting the approaching gravitational disturbances that meant Grand Admiral Vorthak was on his way. "Sir," Flibbert reported with the sort of calm that suggested he'd moved beyond panic into a state of philosophical acceptance, "we're detecting massive hyperspace distortions. The Grand Admiral will arrive in approximately 2 hours." Admiral Gorthak looked at his newly reorganized fleet, then at the view screen where a human was calmly explaining why sometimes the best defense was making your enemy think you were completely insane, and made a decision that would probably define the rest of his career. "Signal the fleet," he ordered. "All ships are to prepare for combat operations according to the new tactical guidelines." "Sir, the new guidelines don't actually include any specific tactical guidelines." "Exactly. Tell them to figure it out as they go along." This was either the best decision Admiral Gorthak had ever made, or the worst. Given recent events, he was no longer entirely sure there was a difference. Grand Admiral Vorthak the Terrible approached Earth in a ship that was less a spacecraft and more a floating monument to the concept of overwhelming force. The inevitable domination was 10 miles long, bristled with enough weapons to sterilize small moons, and was accompanied by 5,000 ships that collectively represented the finest military force the galaxy had ever seen. Grand Admiral Vorthak himself was a member of a species that looked like someone had crossed a dragon with a particularly aggressive board of directors. He had personally conquered 47 star systems, destroyed 6 rebellions, and once made an entire species extinct because they'd had the audacity to develop a form of art he found aesthetically displeasing. He was not known for his patience. "Status report," he commanded, as his fleet dropped out of hyperspace in perfect formation. "Sir," his aide reported with the sort of nervous efficiency that came from working for someone who considered summary execution a management tool. "Admiral Gorthak's fleet appears to be intact, but they're not responding to our communications." "Not responding? Define not responding." "They're acknowledging our signals, sir, but they're not following standard fleet protocols. Their formation is unusual." Grand Admiral Vorthak studied the tactical display with growing irritation. Instead of the neat, orderly arrangement he'd expected to find, Admiral Gorthak's ships were scattered across local space in what appeared to be a completely random pattern. "This is unacceptable!" he roared. "Signal Admiral Gorthak immediately. I want an explanation for this breach of military discipline." The communication came through almost immediately, but instead of Admiral Gorthak's familiar bridge, the view screen showed what appeared to be the interior of a primitive dwelling, where 5 beings were sitting around a wooden table, having what looked like a casual conversation. "Grand Admiral," Admiral Gorthak's voice came from off-screen. "Thank you for responding so quickly to our tactical consultation request." "Your what?" "We've been conducting an innovative military training exercise with a local tactical specialist," Admiral Gorthak explained, sounding remarkably cheerful for someone whose career was probably about to end. "I think you'll find the results quite illuminating." Grand Admiral Vorthak stared at the screen, trying to process what he was seeing. One of the beings around the table was clearly not consortium personnel, and was looking directly at the camera with the sort of calm interest that suggested he wasn't particularly impressed by Grand Admirals or their fleets. "Admiral Gorthak," the Grand Admiral said very slowly, "please explain to me why you are conducting military exercises with primitives instead of conquering them." "Well, sir, we discovered some significant flaws in our standard tactical doctrine when tested against opponents who actually fight back. Opponents who—" "What?" "You heard him right," Barney said, speaking directly to the camera. "Your boys here learned a valuable lesson about the difference between theory and practice." Grand Admiral Vorthak's 4 eyes focused on the human with the sort of intensity usually reserved for targeting computers. "And you are?" "Gunnery Sergeant Barnaby Crustworth, United States Marine Corps, retired, and you're the fellow who's been sending fleets to my neighborhood without an invitation." The silence that followed this introduction was the sort of profound quiet that usually precedes either enlightenment or apocalypse. "You," Grand Admiral Vorthak said very quietly, "are a single primitive human." "That's right." And you believe you can threaten the finest military force in the galaxy?" "I don't need to threaten anybody. Your boy Gorthak here already learned what happens when you underestimate the opposition." "Admiral Gorthak learned nothing!" the Grand Admiral roared. "He has been seduced by primitive savagery, but I will show you the true power of the consortium. Prepare to—" "Hold on there, Admiral," Barney interrupted, with the sort of casual authority that came from decades of dealing with officers who thought volume was a substitute for competence. "Before you start blowing things up, you might want to take a look at your tactical situation." "My tactical situation is perfect. I have 5,000 ships against your— what? 400 confused vessels and 1 mouthy primitive. Check your sensors, Admiral. I think you'll find the situation is a little more complicated than that." Grand Admiral Vorthak turned to his sensor operator with the expression of someone who was beginning to suspect that his day was about to get significantly worse. "Sir," the sensor operator reported nervously, "I'm detecting anomalous readings. throughout local space. What kind of anomalous readings? Well, sir, it appears that Admiral Gorthak's ships have dispersed throughout the solar system. They're not maintaining formation, and their movement patterns are unpredictable. So, we'll destroy them one by one if necessary. That's the problem, sir. According to our tactical computers, they're not where they're supposed to be. Every time we acquire a target lock, it moves before we can fire. That's impossible! Also, sir, the sensor operator continued with the tone of someone delivering very bad news, several of Admiral Gorthak's ships appear to be hiding behind the planet's natural satellites. Hiding? Hiding? This is the Galactic Military Consortium. We do not hide. Nevertheless, sir, they appear to be using the gravitational shadows of the various moons to mask their sensor signatures. It's actually quite clever. Grand Admiral Vorthak stared at his displays with the growing realization that something was very, very wrong. His perfect formation was being harassed by ships that refused to stay in one place, couldn't be targeted effectively, and seemed to be following no recognizable tactical doctrine whatsoever. "This is chaos," he declared. "Yes," Barney agreed cheerfully from the view screen. "Isn't it wonderful? Wonderful! This is a complete breakdown of military order. This is what happens when you fight people who don't follow your rule book. We have the superior technology. We have the overwhelming numbers. You have a bunch of big, slow ships in a predictable formation, facing opponents who are smaller, faster, and don't care about looking pretty while they kick your ass." This observation was punctuated by the sudden appearance of 3 of Admiral Gorthak's ships, which materialized from behind Earth's moon and immediately opened fire on the nearest vessels in Grand Admiral Vorthak's formation. Before the Grand Admiral's ships could respond, the attackers had already disappeared back into the gravitational shadow, leaving behind smoking wreckage and a lot of very confused tactical officers. "That's impossible!" Grand Admiral Vorthak screamed. "Our ships are faster, our weapons are more powerful, our defenses are superior." "Your ships are bigger," Barney corrected. "That's not the same thing. Your weapons are more powerful in a straight fight, but they can't hit what they can't target. And your defenses are designed to stop the kind of attacks you expect, not the kind you're actually getting." As if to emphasize this point, Admiral Gorthak's voice came over the communication system. "Grand Admiral, this is Gorthak. I'm afraid we're going to have to ask you to surrender." "Surrender! I have 5,000 ships." "Yes, sir, and they're all sitting in a nice, neat formation that makes excellent target practice. Meanwhile, my 400 ships are scattered throughout the system. They're moving unpredictably, and they've been trained by a tactical specialist who apparently knows quite a lot about defeating superior forces." "This is madness." "Actually," Norbert chimed in from the view screen, consulting his datapad, "according to my calculations, this is mathematics. Your formation maximizes your firepower, but also maximizes your vulnerability to unconventional tactics. It's quite fascinating from a statistical standpoint. Also," Bixby added helpfully, "we've been modifying our weapon systems according to some very interesting principles Barney taught us about improvised warfare. And," Griselda concluded, waving one of her inevitable charts, "our projected casualty ratios suggest that you're going to lose this fight rather badly." Grand Admiral Vorthak stared at the view screen, where 4 of the galaxy's most incompetent military contractors were explaining why his perfect fleet was about to be defeated by principles they'd learned from a human farmer. "This is impossible," he whispered. "No," Barney said gently. "This is just Tuesday. Would you like some coffee while we discuss terms?" The Battle of Earth, as historians would later call it, lasted exactly 47 minutes and 12 seconds. It consisted of Admiral Gorthak's 400 ships conducting a running battle against Grand Admiral Vorthak's 5,000 vessels, using tactics that violated every principle of conventional warfare and somehow worked anyway. Ships appeared from impossible angles, fired at targets they shouldn't have been able to hit, and disappeared before return fire could be coordinated. Command structures adapted on the fly. Communication protocols were improvised in real time, and strategic objectives were accomplished through methods that no military academy had ever taught. By the end of it, Grand Admiral Vorthak had lost nearly 1,000 ships. His remaining forces were scattered across 3 solar systems, and his tactical computers had apparently suffered the equivalent of nervous breakdowns from trying to process enemy behavior that made no logical sense. "I don't understand," he said weakly, as Admiral Gorthak's ships regrouped around Earth in formations that still looked completely random but somehow seemed to work. "How is this possible?" "Simple," Barney explained from his kitchen table, where he was making another pot of coffee because the conversation had gone on longer than expected. "You spent 40 years fighting enemies who fought the way you expected them to fight. We spent the last few hours teaching your boys how to fight enemies who don't give a damn about your expectations. But the principles of warfare, the doctrines, the established tactics are all very useful," Barney agreed. "When you're fighting someone who learned the same principles, follows the same doctrines, and uses the same tactics. When you're fighting someone who doesn't, you need to be able to adapt. This goes against everything I know about military science." "Military science is just organized common sense," Barney said patiently. "The problem comes when the organization becomes more important than the sense." Grand Admiral Vorthak slumped in his command chair, staring at tactical displays that showed his invincible fleet scattered and demoralized by an opponent who shouldn't have been able to offer any resistance at all. "What happens now?" he asked quietly. "Well," Barney said, "that depends on what you want to have happen. You can keep fighting, in which case Admiral Gorthak's people are going to continue making your life difficult until you run out of ships or patience. Or you can sit down and have a conversation about how to make this situation work for everybody." "Work for everybody?" "Sure. Your bosses want to be able to report successful military operations. Admiral Gorthak wants to save his career. These 4 want to keep their organs attached to their bodies, and I want my barn rebuilt and some compensation for my chickens." "Your chickens?" "I'm still upset about the chickens." "And what do you propose?" Barney smiled. "I propose we completely reorganize the way the Galactic Military Consortium thinks about conquest. Instead of overwhelming force against helpless opponents, how about strategic partnerships with civilizations that might actually be useful allies?" "Allies? We are the Galactic Military Consortium. We do not make alliances with primitives." "Admiral," Barney said gently, "you just got your ass kicked by 4 of the most incompetent beings in the galaxy after they spent 6 hours learning military tactics from one primitive. How primitive do you think we really are?" This was a question that Grand Admiral Vorthak was beginning to suspect had a very disturbing answer. 3 days later, the most unusual peace treaty in galactic history was signed in Barney's kitchen, while his rebuilt barn stood gleaming in the Montana sunshine, and a new flock of chickens pecked around the yard with the sort of determined optimism that suggested they had no idea how close they'd come to being collateral damage in an interstellar incident. The treaty established Earth as the first tactical consultation zone in consortium space, where military forces could receive training in what the official documents diplomatically called unconventional warfare principles. Barney was appointed as the first director of applied military innovation, with a salary that included not only a substantial monetary compensation, but also a promise that no one would ever again blow up his chickens without written permission in triplicate. Quimbleton Fizzlebottom and his team were promoted to senior tactical consultants, with their own office building, constructed according to Earth architectural principles, which apparently included things like doors that open and windows that let in light, and a staff of beings whose main qualification was a demonstrated ability to think outside the box, mostly because they'd never been inside the box to begin with. Admiral Gorthek was assigned as Director of Fleet Modernization, where his new job involved teaching other consortium officers that sometimes the best way to win a war was to convince the enemy that fighting you would be more trouble than it was worth. Grand Admiral Vorthak the Terrible, whose title was quietly changed to Grand Admiral Vorthak the Strategically Flexible, became the head of the new Department of Adaptive Tactics, where he spent his time trying to develop military doctrines that could handle opponents who didn't follow military doctrines. And in the quiet hills of Montana, where the grass grew green and the sky stretched wide and empty, a retired Marine sat on his porch with a cup of coffee and watched the stars with the satisfied expression of someone who had successfully avoided getting involved in other people's problems while somehow ending up in charge of solving them anyway. The universe, he reflected, had a very peculiar sense of humor, but at least his chickens were safe.